Hello, and welcome to the Sacred Heart Shaman podcast, where we talk about spiritual healing, shamanic wisdom, and the challenges of walking the healer's path. My name is Nadia Harenkiu, and today is episode number 19, Surrendering the Self, a Shamanic Guide to Intentional Ego Death. Hello, and thank you for joining me on the podcast today. We are talking about ego death, a super popular discussion amongst people who contact me. And I really want to talk about it from a different perspective today. So, why would someone want to engage in ego death? I'm going to speak from personal experience here because I don't know why other people want to engage in the practice of ego death. But in my experience, ego death is a necessary and ongoing practice that happens as we walk the spiritual path. So, as we progress down our healing journey, there are parts of us that organically ask to fall away and to die. Death is an ongoing process throughout life, both in the physical and in the spiritual. And occasionally we come across an ego death, which is a full persona death. So if you look at the version of yourself that got you to a specific time in your life, let's say you were traumatized, you were in survival mode, you worked your butt off, you became successful, and then you're like, oh crap, I am not happy. There's deeper meaning to life that I'm unable to grasp. This would be a good time for ego death. There is a version of you that was created in order to survive. That version got you to the destination of choice. And now it's time for that version to die so that a more authentic version of you can emerge. In our life, we have ego death periodically, but there's typically like one or two really big ones. And for some people, it's actually more than that. For me, I recently went through this process, and the ego death was around being a mother, being a wife, being the one who gets punished, the one who suffers. It was a traumatized version of me that was really pushing and driving everything that I did until it wasn't working anymore. And it was really clear that I needed to let her go. And I went through this, 6-month long process of ego death. So, we're going to talk a little bit more deeply about ego death and what it means, what it looks like, how to facilitate it, and how to talk about it in the context of psychedelics as well. So, shamans, which is what I would consider myself to be, are natural bringers of death. So a lot of us are called to do death doula work. We do a lot of ego death in ceremony. We do crossing over of spirits and talking to the dead. Like this idea of something transitioning from here to the other side is a big part of what shamans do. We are doulas. And when I meet someone, when I start working with someone, things start to die immediately around them. And this means things that need to go start to go. They start to break down. So I bring a lot of, I guess you could call it like a chaos energy. It's like death and destruction energy, but not in a scary way. And when I interact with a new client, basically anything that's shaky is going to start to deconstruct. It's going to start to fall down because that's what needs to happen anyway. And often we're not able to identify those things in our life, which is why we go to healers and facilitators and shaman to help us deconstruct whatever it is that needs to die. So when I start working with a client, oftentimes like their job will start to die, their relationship, their view of themselves, anything in their life that's no longer serving them, but they have been unable to let it go. That process initiates as soon as we start working together. So basically, my job is to bring death and destruction. And, it's my favorite part about my job, I think, but also my least favorite because it's fairly uncomfortable unless you're ready. So that's, I don't know, kind of a noteworthy thing to take into consideration. So basically, it breaks down things that need to come down. And remember, I talked about in the previous podcast with medication, how medication is like putting scaffolding around a dilapidated house that needs to come down anyway. And so it might be necessary in the moment, but in the long term, we know that house needs to come down. We know it needs to be demolished so that a new, beautiful, like stable house can be built. But sometimes we're not ready for it to happen. So using some very similar metaphor here when discussing what ego death means and what it looks like on the spiritual or astral plane. Constructs that need to die, aspects of ourselves that need to die, um, begin the death process. So I think it's really important to insert here that intentional death is super important in the spiritual path, and you don't need psychedelics to do it. In fact, I don't recommend working with psychedelics to do that. And I'll go into it a little bit more later on. So, lots of people come to me saying that they want ego death with plant medicine. Um, and that's kind of what prompted this discussion. So, we're going to talk a little bit about how to facilitate ego death. So, step one of ego death is identifying the ego that needs to go. And this involves shadow work. So, shadow work is the hardest part of the spiritual path because we often cannot see our own shadow. It is super slippery, it's usually very dark, very well hidden. And the more magical you are, the better you are at concealing your shadow, at putting it in magical hidey holes in different dimensions, at hiding it from yourself. Shadow work, I find, actually gets more difficult the more advanced you get because you get better at hiding it. You get better at, keeping the shadows in the closet. So you really do benefit from having a practitioner or a coach to help you identify where your shadows are. I work with everything from a therapist to a coach to a shaman to a shadow work facilitator. And in different times in my life, each of those things is necessary to help me identify and deconstruct my shadows. So identifying the shadow is step one, the part of you that's running the show and that needs to be brought into the light, which will mean that a part of you needs to be excavated in order for that part to like kind of be in its place, right? So, how do I put this into words? So oftentimes a part of ourself is running the show that we don't want to run the show. Like this part is not conscious. They don't really have our best interest in mind. They have our safety in mind, and it's usually operating from an old paradigm. And so we have to do shadow work to kind of identify why that's happening. And that's the step one of the process. And then we have to do a series of practices to recognize and honor this part. What happened to this aspect of ourself? What did it accomplish in order to get us here today? What are its strengths? Because I'm sure it did some amazing things to make sure that you made it to age 20, 30, 40. What are its belief systems that need to go? Like, what is it carrying belief wise, construct wise, that are no longer serving us? And really just identifying the ego, identifying this aspect of ourself that's been so amazing and so needed up until this point in time is a really important piece to the ego death. Because you must acknowledge these things. You can't just rip them out. And then we have an intentional release or ceremony around the death process. And this can look like a fire ritual. We can do like a rage ceremony. We can work with plant medicine. You can do breath work. I personally really like the fire ceremony because there's so much ritual involved in preparing for it and time and space that leads up to it. And then the ritual of working with the element. It's a really powerful process. That's definitely my favorite for the ego death. And then you need quite a bit of integration time and space after this occurs to kind of digest what happened. Also, cutting away a part of yourself is not instantaneous, nor should it be. That would actually be horrendously traumatic. You have to have the recognition, you have to spend time with it, you have to recognize it in all the ways that it wants to be recognized. You have to honor it after it's gone, right? So How does that part of you that got you here want to be honored? Does it want to have a place on your altar or a place on your fridge? Does it want you to wear a silly sweatshirt on Sundays? Like, how is it that it wants you to remember it? You have to kind of treat this process like somebody is dying that's actually near you in proximity, external from you. So if your mother died, you would have a wake and you would have a funeral and you would have a grieving process and you would go down memory lane and you would put up pictures of her. We need to be treating our own ego death like this, because if we're not properly honoring those parts of ourselves, if we're not properly calling them out and going through the motions of death and grief, there's an incompletion that happens. We're not able to move forward. So grieving is a huge part of this process as well. After you do a ceremony around it, you recognize the part of you that got you here, you're gonna have to grieve the loss of that aspect. And that honestly can take way longer than you expect it to. So there's a period of recovery and rest, and you have to leave space for that to happen if you want what comes next. Otherwise, you get stuck. So if you skip this necessary pause in the process, you won't get to move forward. The new aspect of yourself will not come to light and you will feel incomplete, because it's the equivalent of someone dying, but they don't die well and they get stuck in the in-between space. And that's totally a thing I'm going to talk about in a different podcast, because physical death is a different process in some ways. And when not done properly, it might not fully die. The ego could come back. The tendrils of programming and control can definitely make their way back in, and that kind of defeats the purpose, right? I prefer this very intentional, long-winded, quote unquote, way of ego death over psychedelics. I have a lot of people who come to me looking for ego death with psychedelics. And honestly, it's a horribly traumatic experience. It is like having a part of you ripped out. It creates a different kind of trauma, and it is so much harder to integrate. It also creates a lot of shadow for people, so parts of themselves that they can't heal or identify. And the ego is way more likely to come back in a different form because of that lack of integration, that lack of ability to digest like this big experience that just happened to you. It's kind of one of my, I don't want to say it's one of my gripes, but it's one of the downsides of working with psychedelics or plant medicine, is that it's incredibly hard to integrate something like that. And most people, even with integration coaching and assistance, do not properly integrate these experiences because it's just freaking hard. Like, it's just too intense. Why wouldn't we do it in a more digestible way, a more gentle way? Um, and then also, a lot of times when it happens in a psychedelic experience, you don't actually get to the root. You don't get to the root cause. You don't get to a lot of the familial stuff and the ancestral stuff. It just gets ripped, and now there's a hole that needs to be filled. So I do see that a lot as well. Whereas when we're doing intentional ego death through identifying the shadow pieces, calling forth the self, doing a ritual or ceremony around it, you're really getting the full picture of how you got to where you are, where it comes from, how far back down the family line it comes from, and the true healing happens from that space. Like, that deep, long-standing healing can happen. And that is something that is often missed when it comes to the psychedelic space. Now, I think it's more common to be a problem when we're talking about synthetics like LSD, um, versus mushrooms, which are much more organic and collaborative. But still, it happens in both spaces. And I feel like it's really important to note that. Also, there is this extreme importance to collaborate with the spirit realm. And that also means collaboration with yourself. So if you have this scared part of you that's been running the show and you know they're not serving you anymore and they need to cross over, wouldn't you want to do that with gentleness and love? Like, wouldn't you want to talk to them and say, hey, I really appreciate that you got me here, and I freaking love you, and I see all the wonderful things that you are. And I think it's maybe time for you to step down and let me take over from here. Right? You have to treat these parts of yourself like you would treat friends, not like you would treat people that you hate. And this is something that I think most people need an adjustment of perspective on. We want to go in there and we want to have the ego death and we want to get rid of the part of ourself that's undesirable. Guys, that's so toxic. It's so toxic. There is no part of you that needs to die. There's no part of you that needs to be ripped from you. And if you feel that way, you will create more damage through the endeavor to do that. And this is the more feminine shamanic approach. The approach that I see that brings the most healing to people is this tenderness and this love and collaboration. And when we learn to approach life with this tenderness, everything is easier and everything is more beautiful and everything is more magical. The idea of like we just needed to freaking die is so old world paradigm. It's so absolutely toxic, and it doesn't have to be that way anymore. Like we can give that up. So I'm talking about ego death because over the last few weeks I had identified that a part of me wanted to die, and it wasn't like in a suicidal way. It was like, oh, okay, this part is ready to go. Like, this is the one who needed someone to validate her and needed someone to love her. And she just wanted to help all the people and help all the animals. And this beautiful, beautiful, tender part of Nadia, who had been leading my world, got me into some trouble. She, you know, had me doing work that wasn't, it was super aligned with my soul, but like I was doing healing work without being open to receiving from the universe. So I got run down. I was rescuing animals when I was younger to the point where I got broke. Um, I was choosing relationships for the wrong reasons. There are just so many choices that I absolutely don't regret, and they got me to where I am today. But I had this recognition of like, oh, there's a part of me that's ready to go. Like I need an ego death. And so when I started talking to the spirits, because I've had, parts of myself go before and personas die off, and it's always a big process, but this felt like a big one. And as I prepared for this, the opportunity to participate in a fire ceremony came up, and the woman facilitating told me to prepare a bundle for it. And I was going through my belongings and my pictures and my memories and really taking stock of how amazing I must have been to get me here. The single mother who worked 3 jobs, who lived by herself in the shadiest apartments behind the strip club, who you know, found a father for her child and a partner who could be a good dad. Like what I had to go through to make sure that I survived, 20 years ago, she was still running the show and she needed to be identified and she needed to be honored. And she told me what to do to honor her in this process. And at one point, I felt like I had an entire funeral for her, and I grieved for hours upon hours and weeks, in fact, of grieving the loss of this part of myself and really being grateful. And as a result, I'm able to hold this sensation of gratitude for who I am because I took those steps, because I took the time to recognize what I had been through and to embody it fully. And you can only do that through letting it go, right? This process was absolutely incredible. And over the last 6 months, that is when it became clear that this was the theme for my Italian retreat. So I am hosting a retreat in Italy in the spring. It's my first international one. I've been hosting in the States for 6 or 7 years now. Um, and the theme is going to be intentional ego death. And so I designed this coaching leading up to the retreat, and then the retreat itself. When I meet with someone, we're going to dig into the shadow work. We're going to figure out like what part of the ego is ready to go. We're going to go through the motions to prepare it. Maybe there's going to be plants involved. Maybe there's not. We're going to have some ritual and we're going to get ready. And then we all come together in Tuscany having ceremonies on the land, asking the spirits to assist us in the death process, bringing back inner child parts that have been long forgotten and locked away, bringing back gifts and abilities that have been buried because there was no space for them, and really making a week-long celebration of this ego death process of the letting go what we no longer need and calling in what is really ours. And I'm so stoked about this retreat. So I wanted to create a podcast to talk about intentional ego death. It is a beautiful process, definitely now on my list of things that I can properly do with other people as well as with myself. Although I've been facilitating various forms of ego death for quite some time, this has really taken it to a new level, understanding the different kinds of ceremonies and rituals around it, the different kinds of prep work, and how to integrate and support someone through the ego death process in a way that makes it feel easy and joyful and digestible instead of having it torn from us in an ayahuasca ceremony. So thank you for joining me today to talk about ego death, and feel free to reach out if you should have any questions. I hope you have a wonderful rest of your day. If you enjoyed this podcast and want to know more about me and my work, you can find me at www.sacredheartshaman.com, or you can find my Italian retreats at www.divineharmonyretreats.com. Thank you, and have a great day.